The deputy had delivered lien notices before. He had handed them to men who cursed, to women who wept, to families who packed their wagons before the ink dried. But he had never delivered one to a cabin where a child answered the door holding a cracked slate, chalk dust on her fingers, and a silence behind her that meant someone was missing. Snowmelt ticked from the roof into a tin pan on the porch. The stove inside coughed a line of soot across the floor. The woman standing behind the child did not reach for the paper. She was looking past him, past the track, past the tree line, at the dark mouth of a cave in the bluff, as though it had spoken. The child tugged the woman's sleeve. "Is the cave part of the house too?" The deputy could not meet the girl's eyes. Marit Stensland stood in sleet beside a one-room cabin under a jagged limestone bluff on the south branch of the Root River, Fillmore County, Minnesota. It was the autumn of 1887, and the woman who had crossed an ocean to build a life on proved ground was now trying to remember whether her husband's body had been carried to the church or the granary. The details kept slipping. What would not slip, what held fast like an iron nail-driven flush, was the way the men had described the accident. A rolling oak log. Peter underneath. The crosscut saw still pinched in the kerf above him. He had been cutting winter wood for their proof-up claim, and the wood had killed him. She had 1¼ cords stacked against the east wall of the cabin. She had $23.60 folded into a flour sack behind the stovepipe. She had one milk cow standing in a lean-to that leaked from 3 sides. She had one child, Eli, 6 years old, who had stopped asking when Papa was coming home and started asking whether the cave was part of the house. And she had a cabin measuring 16 by 18 feet, with gaps between the logs wide enough to push a knife blade through. That was the full accounting of what Marit Stensland owned in the world. Peter's unfinished sled runner lay half buried in the first wet snow outside the door. She dragged it free the morning after the burial, not because she needed a sled, but because leaving his last piece of work in the mud felt like agreeing he was gone. The runner was good oak, hand-shaved, the curves set with steam and patience. She leaned it against the cabin wall where it would stay dry and went back inside to count what she owed. The store ledger at Quincy Dar's place in town carried $11.40 against the Stensland name. Nails, lamp oil, a bag of salt, strap hinges, a length of stovepipe. Peter had signed for them. The Homestead Act was clear on the terms. Reside on the claim, make improvements, hold for 5 years. Abandoned before proving up, and the land reverted. Anyone with cash and patience could file on it fresh. Marit knew who had both the cash and the patience. She had seen Quincy Dar walk this bluff parcel twice in the spring, admiring the spring, the cave, the timber access. He had offered to buy before Peter died. He would certainly offer again. She could not leave. Leaving meant the $11 unpaid, the claim lost, the one asset in her name handed to the man who had priced every nail she owned. There was no family to receive her. Her parents were dead in Valdres. Peter's brother had gone to the Dakota Territory and stopped writing. The passage back to Norway cost more than everything in the flour sack. The math did not bend. She would winter here or lose everything Peter had died trying to hold. 3 days after the burial, Reuben Kettle rode up the track on a bay gelding with mud to its hocks. Reuben was 64 years old. He had wintered in Fillmore County since the 1850s, back when the nearest neighbor was a 2-day walk and the wolves still came to the river. He had buried a wife, raised 4 children, and split enough firewood to build a second homestead from the stumps. People in the valley called him honest. Marit called him frightening, because honest men did not soften what they saw. He dismounted without greeting and walked the property the way a doctor walks a sick room. He pressed his thumb into the cabin's south wall and watched it sink into punky chinking. He counted the woodpile by eye. He opened the lean-to door, looked at the cow, looked at the hay, and closed it again. He stood at the lip of the cave 50 feet behind the cabin, spat into the dark, and turned back to Marit. "You have half a roof up there," he said, pointing to the spot where Peter had started doubling the shakes and stopped. "You have wet oak in that pile, maybe 1¼ cords if you're generous with the measure. You need 6 minimum. You need fresh chinking on every wall. You need a south windbreak that doesn't exist. and you need a man with a crosscut saw, which you also do not have." Marit said nothing. Eli stood in the doorway holding a cracked slate with her letters chalked on it. The child watched Reuben the way children watch weather they do not yet understand. "The cave," Reuben continued, jerking his chin toward the limestone mouth behind the cabin, "is a cold cellar fit for potatoes, not breathing people. It will not keep you warm. It will not replace 4 3/4 cords of firewood you do not own. And this bluff catches the northwest wind like a sail catches the sea." He pulled his collar tighter. "You know what they call that wind down here." She knew. The razor wind. The locals had named it for the way it cut through clothing, through chinking, through everything but stone and packed earth. It came off the prairie and funneled through the river valley, and it found every gap in every wall. "Mrs. Stensland," Reuben's voice dropped. He was not cruel. That was the worst part. "A woman alone with a child, 1 cow, and 1 cord of green oak does not survive a Fillmore County winter. You will burn through that wood by Christmas. After Christmas, you will burn furniture. After the furniture, you will be in town asking for charity, and by then Dar will have your name on a quitclaim for the cost of a warm room." He mounted the gelding. He did not offer to cut wood for her. He did not offer to send his sons. Reuben Kettle believed that pity without honesty was cruelty, and he had just given her the most honest inventory anyone would. Marit watched him ride down the track until the sleet swallowed his shape. She went inside, fed Eli cold cornbread, and sat by the stove with the candle burning low. The stove was a small box model, cast iron, second-hand. It heated the cabin adequately when the chinking held and the wood was dry. The chinking did not hold. The wood was not dry. She could feel the draft moving across the floor like a living thing, pooling at the baseboards, slipping under the door, threading through every joint Peter had meant to fix in the spring. She opened the back door and looked at the cave. It sat in the bluff face like a mouth held open, maybe 7 feet wide at the entrance, narrowing to 5 inside. The limestone was pale and dry where the overhang protected it. She had stored potatoes there in September. Peter had talked about aging cheese in it someday. Reuben called it a cold cellar. The valley men ignored it entirely, the way people ignore anything they cannot split with an axe or sell at a mill. Marit closed the door. She did not yet know what she was thinking, but her eyes kept returning to the bluff, and her father's voice kept returning to her memory, and the two things had not yet found each other. That would take a failure first. She tried the conventional solution because she was not foolish enough to skip it. Over the next week, Marit hauled clay from the creek bank, mixed it with chopped straw and dried moss, and packed every gap she could reach in the cabin walls. Her hands cracked and bled. Eli helped carry the smaller buckets. The cow watched from the lean-to with the calm indifference of an animal that has no opinion about human desperation. The chinking held for 4 days. On the 5th night, the first hard north wind arrived. It came down the river valley with a sound like tearing cloth, and it pushed the stove smoke sideways. Marit watched the smoke flatten against the back wall, curl along the ceiling, and slip out through the fresh chinking as though the clay were gauze. By morning, frost laced the inside of every window. Eli's water cup, set on the shelf beside the bed, had a skin of ice across the top. The cabin could not hold heat because the cabin could not stop air. Every gust that found a crack pushed warm air out and dragged cold air in. The stove was not failing. The walls were. Marit carried the last of the potatoes into the cave that afternoon and noticed something. The cave was cold. Her hand against the limestone wall registered cold the way cellar stone always does. But when she stood 10 paces inside, the wind stopped. Completely. The flame on her lantern, which had been dancing and guttering since she lit it, went perfectly still. She held it at arm's length and watched the fire stand upright, steady as a candle in a church. She unwound her shawl from her neck and looked at the fringe. Outside, her breath had frozen on the wool fibers in tiny white crystals. Inside the cave, the crystals were melting. Not fast, not like warmth, but the frost was retreating from the wool, and the air on her face felt nothing like the killing wind above. Marit pressed her palm flat against the cave wall. Cold, steady, unchanging. She pressed her other palm against her own forearm, where the wind had been cutting through her coat for the past hour. That was colder. Something her father had taught her in Valdres surfaced. She had been 9 years old, standing in the root cellar beneath their farmhouse, while her father, a man who measured everything and explained nothing without demonstration, pressed her hand against the cellar wall. Stone, earth-backed, dark with damp. Then he walked her upstairs and pressed her hand against the kitchen wall, which faced the winter fjord wind. "Which is warmer?" he asked. "The cellar," she said. "No, the cellar is always the same. The kitchen is sometimes warmer and sometimes colder. The cellar just refuses to change. Earth does not create heat. It refuses to surrender it quickly. That was the lesson. Not warmth, stability. The ground held its temperature the way a stone holds the sun's heat after dark. Slowly given, slowly lost. The kitchen wall swung between comfort and killing cold, depending on what the wind demanded. The cellar wall did not care about the wind at all. The cave was a cellar without a house above it. It sat at roughly 48 degrees year-round, give or take what the entrance geometry allowed. It would never be warm, but it would never be 20 below zero either. The difference between 48 degrees and 20 below was the difference between discomfort and death. Marit walked back to the cabin with the lantern and stood at the back door. She looked at the cave mouth 52 feet away. She looked at the stove, which was eating wet oak and losing the fight against the walls. She looked at Eli, who was sitting on the bed with a quilt pulled over her shoulders. The stove was not the problem. The air was the problem. Every draft that entered the cabin forced the stove to heat air from scratch, air that arrived at whatever the outside temperature was. If the outside was 20 below, the stove was starting from 20 below. If the outside was 40 below, the stove was starting from 40 below. The colder the night, the harder the stove worked, the faster the wood burned, and the less warmth actually stayed in the room. The cabin was not a shelter. It was a sieve. But what if the replacement air did not come from outside? What if it came from the cave? Marit found Peter's chalk line in the toolbox and tied one end to the back door sill. She walked the line to the cave mouth, held it taut, and counted her paces. 52 feet. She could see both doors from the midpoint. The ground between cabin and cave was shallow soil over limestone, with a slight downhill grade toward the cave, maybe an inch and a half of fall every 10 feet. Water would drain toward the cave, not toward the cabin. That mattered. She found the flower board Peter had used for figuring lumber cuts and scratched a cross-section with a nail. A passage, 3 feet wide, 5 feet high. Oak post frames every 4 feet. Roof of split oak slabs, bark side up, covered with 18 to 24 inches of excavated clay, soil, and sod. 2 doors, one at the cabin end, one at the cave end. Drainage ditches flanking the floor, sloping toward a stone sump near the cave. The passage would not heat the cabin. The passage would change what the cabin breathed. Instead of gulping 40 below air through every crack, the cabin would draw air through the tunnel, where 52 feet of earth-covered passage would buffer it. The air entering the cabin would arrive at something near cave temperature, the low 40s, perhaps the high 30s in the worst cold. The stove would heat air that started near cellar temperature instead of death temperature. The difference in fuel consumption would be enormous. It was not a furnace. It was a lung. Beret Kavami arrived 2 days later, driving a wagon with her 3 sons wedged between flour sacks. Beret was 41, raw-boned, Norwegian-born like Marit, widowed 3 years earlier when her husband fell through river ice hauling timber. She had survived by doing what women were supposed to do. She took in mending, raised chickens, and accepted help from the church. She respected Marit because Marit did not beg. She also thought Marit was about to die, and she had come to say so plainly because Norwegian women did not let each other walk into graves without a word. Marit showed her the flower board drawing. Beret studied it for a long time. Then she said, "The cave is damp. Damp kills slow." "I am not sleeping in the cave," Marit said. "You are connecting your house to it." "I am connecting the air. The cave stays near 48 degrees. The tunnel is buried in earth. When the wind hits the cabin, instead of pulling in air at 40 below, the stove pulls through the passage. It heats air that is already halfway warmed. Beret put her finger on the drawing where the cave door was marked. And if the cave breathes back? If the draw goes wrong? You fill your cabin with damp air and you freeze in your sleep, wet. 2 doors, Marit said. 1 at each end. I control the draw. I crack the cave door 3 inches. I close the cabin door tight. I let the stove pull the air through. The passage is the buffer. The doors are the control. And if the passage floods? Drainage ditches, stone sump. Water runs to the cave, not the cabin. And if it collapses? Oak frames every 4 feet. Roof slabs overlapping. 18 inches of earth on top. Beret looked at Marit the way she looked at her own sons when they did something that was either brave or stupid, and she could not yet tell which. You're going to spend nails and weeks building a dirt tunnel instead of cutting wood. I cannot cut 6 cords alone. I do not have the saw, the strength, or the time. But I can dig, I can frame. And if this works, I burn 2 cords instead of 6. If. Beret left the flower board on the table and drove home without another word. She did not call Marit foolish. She did not call her brave. She left the word if sitting in the room like a stone on a scale, and Marit felt the weight of it after the wagon was gone. The mockery started before the first post was set. Quincy Dar owned the only general store within a half-day's ride. He was 53, Yankee-born, Connecticut-raised, and he had come to Fillmore County not to homestead, but to sell to those who did. He ran credit the way a trapper runs a line, generous at first, tight when it mattered, and always in his favor. He held notes on a dozen families. He held Marit's for $11.40. He also held something less visible, an interest in the Bluff parcel. The spring on Marit's land ran year-round. The cave was dry and deep enough for storage. The timber was good oak and elm. If Marit failed her proof-up, the land reverted, and Quincy could file on it for the cost of the government fee. He came to the cabin on a Tuesday morning with a ledger book and a face arranged for sympathy. Mrs. Stensland, I know this is a hard time. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, but his eyes moved across the property the way Rubens had, counting, measuring, subtracting. I want you to know that I am prepared to take the burden of this claim. I will settle your account, pay the back taxes, and see to it that you and the girl have a clean start. I have work in town, seamstress position, a room above the store. No, Marit said. Quincy's face did not change. He had expected the first refusal. The offer stands. Winter does not negotiate. Neither do I. He left. But the conversation was not over. It moved to the store, where men gathered around the stove in the evenings and talked about who would make it through the season and who would not. Quincy made sure they talked about Marit. He made sure they knew about the cave. He made sure the phrase landed where it would travel. She's building a coffin sideways. The men laughed. From outside, Marit's project did look absurd. A widow digging a trench from her back door toward a cave, framing it with timber she could barely lift, covering it with dirt she hauled in a bucket. Every other household in the valley was stacking wood, banking walls, laying in salt pork and flour. Marit was digging a hole. The laughter became a verdict. At the store, men shook their heads. Women stopped sending children to play with Eli, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of the same instinct that makes people step back from a person standing too close to a cliff edge. They did not want their children near what was coming. The church sewing circle sent a basket of food with a note pinned inside. Accept Mr. Dar's practical offer before the snow decides for you. Eli came home one afternoon with mud on her coat and silence in her face. Marit asked what happened. Eli said boys at the creek had called the tunnel the widow hole. She said it the way children say things that have hurt them, flat, quiet, the meaning stored behind the words where adults have to dig to find it. Marit knelt in front of her daughter and held both her hands. Do you know what we are building? A way to the cave. A way to keep warm. Your papa could not finish the woodcutting. I cannot finish it alone. but I can build something that changes what the stove needs. Do you understand? Eli shook her head. She was 6. She did not understand thermodynamics or replacement air or the physics of earth mass buffering, but she understood that her mother was not stopping, and in the mathematics of childhood, that counted as an answer. Marit kept working because the alternative was Quincy Dar's seamstress room above the store, and that room was the end of the claim, the end of the land, the end of everything Pater had bled into this bluff. Dependence meant loss. The tunnel meant a chance. She had never built anything underground in her life. She had never framed a structure longer than a chicken coop, but she had watched her father build, and she had watched Petter build, and she had hands that could hold a shovel until the blisters broke and healed and broke again. She started digging on a cold morning in late October, with frost on the grass and her breath hanging white against the limestone bluff. The first 8 feet went fast. The soil was shallow, only 10 to 14 inches before she hit limestone rubble and clay. She trenched the width at 3 feet, the depth at 5, and set her first 2 oak post frames using timber Pater had already rough cut before he died. The posts were 6-inch diameter, the cross beams slightly thinner, and she seated each one on a flat piece of limestone, the way she had seen root cellars framed in Valdres. Stone base, timber upright, crossbeam notched and pegged. The work was brutal. She swung the mattock to break clay. She shoveled loose material into buckets. She hauled each bucket up the trench wall and dumped it along the sides where it would later become the covering. Eli carried water. The cow watched from the lean-to. Nobody came to help. By the end of the first week, she had 12 feet of open trench with 2 frames standing. The frames looked skeletal against the bluff, raw oak ribs poking from a wound in the earth. She had not yet roofed any section because she did not have enough split slabs. Splitting slabs from oak rounds required a froe and a mallet, and the froe was dull. She spent half a day sharpening it on Pater's whetstone and split 9 slabs before her shoulders seized. The second week brought rain. Not a storm, just a steady cold saturating rain that filled the trench to ankle depth and turned the clay banks to grease. Marit bailed with the milk pail. She bailed for 6 hours. She bailed until the handle raised a blood blister across her right palm and the blister tore open. She wrapped her hand in a strip of petticoat, bailed for 2 more hours, and then sat in the mud at the bottom of the trench and looked at the water seeping from the walls and understood that this project would either have drainage or it would have nothing. She had not yet addressed drainage because she had been racing to get frames up before the ground froze. But water was the enemy before cold was the enemy. A flooded trench could not be framed. A wet tunnel would rot the timbers in a single season. She needed stone-lined ditches on both sides of the floor, sloped toward the cave end, feeding into a sump she had not yet built. That meant stopping forward progress to go backward. 2 days of cutting drainage channels. 2 days she did not have. The ground was hardening. Each morning the frost line crept deeper. If the clay froze before she finished the trench, she would be digging through iron until spring, and spring was 5 months away, and she had fuel for maybe 10 weeks. She dug the drainage ditches. It cost her the rest of the second week. She lined them with flat limestone scavenged from the bluff face, set at a slight pitch, 1.5 inches of fall every 10 feet, just as she had drawn on the flower board. The sump near the cave end was a hole 2 feet deep, walled with stacked stone, covered with a flat slab she could lift to clear debris. When the next rain came, water ran down the ditches and into the sump instead of pooling on the floor. It worked. The trench drained. She lost 2 days and gained a passage that would not drown. 27 feet trenched by the end of the second week. 4 frames set, 6 roof slabs laid over the first section, bark side up. Her hands were raw. The blisters had broken, healed into calluses, and then split again along new lines. Her back ached in a place between the shoulder blades that felt like a rope pulled too tight. She ate cold cornbread and salt pork standing up because sitting down meant she might not stand again. Her coat hung looser across the shoulders. Eli noticed before Marit did. "Mama, your face is different." "I'm tired." "No, your face is smaller." She was losing weight she could not afford to lose. The salt pork was rationed. The flour was rationed. The potatoes in the cave were the only supply that did not come with a number attached to a deadline. She fed Eli first, always, and what remained was never quite enough to replace what the digging took. She could feel it in the mornings, a lightness behind the eyes, a delay between deciding to lift the mattock and the mattock actually rising. The body was keeping score even when the mind refused to. The third week brought a new problem. She hit a shelf of solid limestone at the 30-foot mark, 2 feet below the surface. The mattock bounced. The shovel rang. She spent an entire day chipping a channel through it with Pater's cold chisel and a 4-pound hammer, gaining 8 inches for every hour of labor. The stone came away in pale flakes that smelled like rain on dust. By the end of the day, she had cleared enough to set the next frame, but her right wrist had swollen to the point where she could not close her fingers around the chisel handle. She worked left-handed the next morning. The frames went crooked. She pulled them, reset them, and pulled them again. Precision mattered. A crooked frame meant a crooked roof line, and a crooked roof line meant uneven earth loading, and uneven loading meant collapse. She could not afford to be tired enough to be sloppy. The woodpile was shrinking. She burned a quarter cord in the first 2 weeks of November, just keeping the cabin above freezing at night. At that rate, she would exhaust her supply before Christmas. The math had not changed since Reuben stated it. She needed 6 cords for a conventional winter. She had started with 1 1/4 and now had roughly 1 cord remaining. If the tunnel did not work, she would be burning furniture by the new year, just as Reuben had predicted. And the first real frost came, not the light silver on the grass, the hard frost, the kind that cracked mud into plates and turned standing water to glass by morning. She could feel the ground tightening under her shovel. Each morning the digging started harder, the clay resisting the blade like clenched muscle. Each afternoon the clay loosened just enough to move, but the working hours shrank as the sun dropped lower and earlier. She was in a race, and the race was against the earth itself, and the earth was winning by inches every night. It was into this race that Quincy Dar made his second move. Marit walked to the blacksmith to buy hinge straps for the tunnel doors. The blacksmith shook his head. Sold out. Quincy Dar had bought the last 4 pairs that morning. He did not need hinge straps. He had a store full of hardware, but Marit needed them, and that was enough. She stood in the road outside the smithy with her hand throbbing and her jaw set, and her $23 shrinking in the flour sack, and understood that Quincy was not just waiting for her to fail. He was making sure she did. The unexpected help came from the road. Niels Moen was a teamster, 34, quiet the way draft horses are quiet, not empty, but conserving. He hauled lime barrels between the kilns and the river landings, and he passed the bluff parcel twice a week. He had seen the trench. He had seen Marit resetting the same post 3 times because the base stone kept shifting. He had not stopped because stopping to help a widow invited talk, and talk in a small valley had weight. But he stopped that day, not because of charity, because Marit was standing in the road with no hinge straps and a face that said the next thing to break would be something that did not heal. "I have 2 wagon straps, iron, worn but straight," Niels said from the seat of his wagon. "I have a day free and a team of oxen that could drag your roof slabs into place faster than you can carry them." Marit looked at him. She looked at the oxen, 2 broad-chested Durhams with frost on their muzzles. She looked at the trench behind her, half-roofed, the open sections filling with dead leaves the wind sent skittering across the clay. "What do you want for it?" "My winter coat has a tear from collar to hem. I was told you mend." "I mend. Then we trade." It was not romance. It was not rescue. It was the economy of people who had nothing to spare and everything to lose, and it was the first time since Pater's death that anyone had offered Marit a transaction instead of pity. Niels did not tell her the tunnel was clever. He did not tell her it was foolish. He backed the oxen to the woodlot, hitched a chain to a green oak round, and dragged it to the splitting station beside the trench. Then he dragged another, then 4 more. By noon, he had moved more timber in half a day than Marit had moved in a week. The oxen worked without complaint. Niels worked without conversation. When Marit split slabs with the fro, He carried them to the trench and laid them across the frames, bark side up, overlapping at the edges the way she showed him. By dark, the roofed section had doubled. 14 feet of closed passage now stretched from the cabin end, framed and slabbed and ready for earth covering. Niels hitched his team and drove off with a torn coat folded under the wagon seat and a brief nod that carried no debt in either direction. Marit had the hinge straps. She had 6 new roof slabs she could not have moved alone, and a stretch of covered passage that changed the shape of the project from desperate to possible. She had lost a day's mending she could not afford and gained a day's labor she could not have bought. 34 feet covered or trenched, 18 feet to go. November was half gone. The race continued. The ground froze another inch deeper every night. The working hours shrank. Marit dug by lantern light when the moon was bright enough to cast shadows, gaining 2 or 3 extra feet of trench in the blue cold after Eli slept. Reuben Kettle rode past on the following Saturday and sat on his horse looking at the open trench with its frames and drainage ditches and partial roof. He sat for a long time. Marit did not stop working. She was on her knees in the trench, chipping frozen clay from the base of a post hole, and she did not look up because looking up meant stopping, and stopping meant the frost gained another hour. "You have built a fine place to be buried," he said. Marit hung the lantern at the cabin end of the completed section and walked to the other end. The flame burned steady, no draft, no flicker. The air inside the roofed passage was still and cool and smelled like earth and oak bark. She pointed at the flame. Reuben looked at it for a long time. He did not say she was right. He did not say he was wrong. He said, 25 feet is a long way to dig before the ground freezes shut. Then he rode home. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could see the labor, but not the reason behind it? 18 feet. The ground hardening an inch deeper every night. A stove eating wet wood faster than Marit could replace it. A child who slept in her coat. A hostile storekeeper buying up the hardware she needed. A cow that consumed more hay than Marit owned. A body that was losing weight it could not spare. Hands that bled through their calluses. A wrist that throbbed when the temperature dropped. And somewhere in the limestone bluff behind her, a cave breathing air at 48 degrees, waiting for a passage that was only 2/3 built, while the sky above Minnesota pulled the temperature down like a hand closing over a throat. The tunnel was not finished. Winter was not waiting. And somewhere on the road between the kilns and the river landing, a man she barely knew was wearing a coat she had not yet mended, and a storekeeper who wanted her land was counting the days until the cold did his work for him. The sidewall slumped on a Wednesday. Marit had set the post at the 36-foot mark, tamped the base stone, braced the upright with a wedge of split oak, and started fitting the crossbeam when the clay wall on the north side shifted. Not a collapse. A slow, wet slide, like a tired animal lying down. The clay peeled from the limestone substrate and folded into the trench, burying the base stone, tilting the post, and pushing the drainage ditch flat. 2 hours of work erased in 10 seconds. She stood in the trench with clay to her shins and felt the kind of anger that lives underneath exhaustion. Not hot, not sharp, just a deep and steady pressure behind the breastbone that had nowhere to go. She reset the post, cleared the clay, rebuilt the drainage channel, set the base stone again. The post tilted. The clay had not stopped moving. The substrate was wet here, a seep line running through the limestone where groundwater found a path. Every time she tamped the base, the water loosened it. Every time she braced the upright, the wet clay shifted against it. She reset it a third time. It held for 20 minutes. Then the north wall breathed again, and the post leaned like a man falling asleep standing up. That was when Tolaf Asen stopped on the road. He was 61 years old, Norwegian-born, with hands the size of small shovels, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone Marit was fighting. He had spent 19 years in the lead mines of the Upper Mississippi District before his lungs told him to stop. He had come to Fillmore County to farm, but farming did not erase what the mines had taught him. He knew underground. He knew timber. He knew what happened when you set a post into wet ground and expected it to stand. He did not introduce himself. He stood at the edge of the trench, looked at the tilting post, looked at the seep line darkening the clay, and said, "Show me where the water goes." Marit pointed to the drainage ditch. Then she pointed to the slope, the 1.5 inches of fall every 10 feet toward the cave end. Then she pointed to the stone sump. Tolliff studied the slope for a moment. Then he climbed into the trench without asking permission, pressed his boot against the base stone, and watched it rock. "You cannot set a roof post straight into wet soil," he said. "The water works underneath. Every freeze, the ice lifts it. Every thaw, it settles crooked. A mine timberman who sets posts into wet floor gets buried." He knelt and pulled the base stone free. Underneath, the clay was dark with moisture, soft enough to push a finger through. "You need flat limestone, wider than the post by 4 inches in every direction, and you wedge it tight, oak wedges driven with a mallet, not just tamped dirt. The stone spreads the load. The wedges lock the stone to the ground. The ground can move, but the post moves with it instead of falling away from it." Marit did not ask who he was. She asked, "Where do I find flat limestone that wide?" Tolliff pointed at the bluff face behind the cave mouth. "There, the bedding planes split clean if you know where to hit." He paused. He looked at the trench, the frames, the drainage, the partial roof, the measurements scratched on the flower board that Marit had nailed to a stake at the cabin end. He looked at it the way Reuben had looked at it, but the conclusion he reached was different. "You have thought about water," he said. "That is more than most people do above ground, let alone under it." It was not a compliment. It was an assessment. Tolliff did not give compliments. He recognized competence the way a farrier recognizes a well-shod hoof by what it does, not by what the maker says about it. Marit had built drainage before she had built walls. That told him something about how she thought. He came back the next morning with a mallet, a set of oak wedges, and a flat piece of limestone he had split from the bluff in the time it took Marit to feed Eli breakfast. The teaching began through work. Tolliff did not lecture. He demonstrated, then watched Marit repeat the action, then corrected by pointing at the specific thing that was wrong. He spoke in short sentences because the mine had taught him that underground long explanations killed people. You said what mattered. You said it once. You made sure the other person understood before the next step. First lesson, cribbing. The base stone must be wider than the post. The wedges must be driven from opposite sides so they pinch the post between them. The stone must sit on undisturbed ground, not on fill or loose clay. If the ground is wet, drain it first, then set the stone. Never build on water you have not moved. Second lesson, lagging. The roof slabs must overlap like shingles, bark side up. The bark sheds water and dirt. If the slabs are laid flat with gaps between them, sifted soil falls through and piles on the floor, and every pile of soil on the floor is weight that should be on the roof. The overlap must be at least 3 inches. If the slabs are too short to overlap, add a middle support post and use shorter spans. Third lesson, bad air testing. Before trusting any enclosed passage, carry a candle low, knee height, and watch the flame. If it burns steady, the air moves. If it dims, the air is dead. If it goes out, leave. Candle low because bad air sinks. A man can breathe fine standing up and die on his knees in the same passage. The mines taught this with bodies. Tolliff intended to teach it with words. Fourth lesson, door discipline. Never leave a wide open connection between a warm space and a cool passage without a second door. Moving air is useful only when controlled. One door open, the other cracked. It creates a draw, a slow pull of air from the cool end to the warm end, regulated by the gap width. Both doors open at once, and the system becomes a wind tunnel. The air moves too fast to buffer. The earth cannot warm it. The passage becomes a highway for cold instead of a filter against it. Marit absorbed the lessons the way dry wood absorbs oil, quickly, completely, without excess. She asked questions that Tolliff had to think about before answering. How much earth cover is enough? 18 inches minimum, he said. 24 is better. More than 30 starts to risk the frame unless you overbuild. What if the cave draws smoke backward? It will not, he said. If the cabin stove creates enough updraft to pull from the cave end, the stove is the engine, the cave is the reservoir, the tunnel is the pipe between them. But if the stove goes out and both doors are open, the cave air will push toward the cabin because warm air is lighter and rises, creating a pressure difference. That is why doctor discipline matters. They worked together for 3 days. Tolliff reset every post Marit had placed in the wet section, splitting new base stones from the bluff and driving oak wedges with a precision that made the frames look architectural instead of desperate. He showed her how to check each crossbeam for level by filling a tin cup with water and setting it on top. If the water sat even, the beam was true. If it pooled to one side, the beam needed shimming. On the third evening, Tolliff sat on a stump outside the cabin and drank chicory coffee Marit had boiled on the stove. He did not ask about Pater. He did not mention the community's opinion. He asked about the cave. How far back does it go? I have walked 40 paces with a lantern. It narrows, but does not end. Dry the whole way? Dry walls. The floor has a damp spot near the back, but the entrance section is dry as bone. Good. A wet cave will kill this idea. A dry cave is the best partner you could have. He looked at the trench, now 38 feet long, with 12 frames standing and the first 20 feet roofed and earth covered. You understand what you are building is not a tunnel. It is a second wall. The cabin has one wall between you and the cold. This passage gives you 52 feet of earth wall on every side. The cold has to eat through all of that dirt before it reaches the air you breathe. Reuben called it a grave, Marit said. Reuben has never been underground. Tolliff set down the cup. I have. A grave has no air, no drainage, no doors. This has all three. A grave is where you end up when you do not think about water. You thought about water first. He stood. I will come back Saturday. We will roof the middle section. He came back Saturday, and the Tuesday after, and the following Saturday. He never stayed more than a day. He never explained why he helped. But each visit advanced the passage by 4 to 6 feet, and each visit deposited another piece of knowledge in Marit's hands that she could not have found in any book available to her. The construction became measurable in a way that gave the work rhythm. Week 3. 38 feet trenched, 20 roofed and covered. Week 4. 44 feet, 32 covered. The last 8 feet were the hardest because the ground near the cave mouth was all limestone rubble, and every post hole had to be chiseled rather than dug. Marit's hands bled through the calluses she had built. Her right wrist, swollen from the limestone shelf encounter, had settled into a dull ache that sharpened when the temperature dropped. She wrapped it with a strip of woolen cloth and worked through the pain because the pain was not the deadline. November was the deadline. Eli helped where she could. She carried flat stones for the drainage channel. She held the lantern when Marit worked after dark. She learned to read the candle flame the way Tolliff had taught. Steady means safe. Dim means stop. Out means leave. She was 6 years old, and she could test the air in an underground passage. The frontier did not wait for childhood to end before making its demands. The weather tracked the progress like a rival. The first week of November, frost every morning, thaw by noon. The second week, frost by morning, partial thaw by afternoon, refreezing by dark. The third week, the thaw stopped coming, the ground set like concrete. Marit dug the last 6 feet through frozen clay that came away in chips and shards, each shovelful a negotiation between steel and earth. The mattock handle cracked. She bound it with wire and kept swinging. 3 feet to go. 2. 1. On the 28th of November, Marit set the last frame at the cave mouth and laid the final roof slab across it. Tolliff drove the wedges. Eli held the lantern. The passage was complete from cabin to cave. 52 feet of framed, roofed, earth-covered timber tunnel with 2 heavy plank doors, clay-packed seams, stone-lined drainage ditches, and a small sliding vent cut into the cave-end door. It was not pretty. The sod covering humped along the ground like the spine of a buried animal. The cabin end door was hung on Niels Moen's wagon straps instead of proper hinges. The cave-end door was rougher still, split planks pegged together and fitted into a frame that Tolliff had squared with an axe. But every post stood on flat limestone. Every crossbeam sat level. Every roof slab overlapped the next by 3 inches, bark side up. The drainage ditches ran clear to the sump. Mart opened the cabin end door and held the candle at knee height. The flames stood still. She walked the full length of the passage, 52 feet of cool, earth-scented darkness, and emerged at the cave mouth with the flames still burning steady. Behind her, the cabin stove sent a thin line of smoke into the gray sky. Ahead, the cave breathed air that had not changed temperature since before she was born. Between them, a passage that every man in the valley had called a grave, a coffin, a widow hole. It was finished, but it had never faced real cold. December brought the first proof. On a night when the mercury in Reuben's porch thermometer dropped to 12 below zero, Marit performed the test she had been building toward for 2 months. She narrowed the stove damper to half. She opened the cave-in door exactly 3 inches, a gap she measured with a block of wood cut to size. She closed the cabin end door tight and hung the wool curtain Tolef had made her add, a heavy blanket nailed across the frame with a 6-inch gap at the bottom where air could be drawn through without the curtain billowing. Then she waited. The stove drew. She could feel it, a faint, steady pull of air moving from the cave, through the passage, under the curtain, and into the cabin where the stove's appetite sucked it upward and out the chimney. The air entering the room was not warm. It was cool the way a cellar is cool. But it was not killing cold. It was not 12 below. It was something in the high 30s, maybe the low 40s, air that had traveled 52 feet through earth-covered passage and arrived tempered by the mass of soil and stone surrounding it. By dawn, the back room Cham, the farthest point from the stove, held 38 degrees. The tunnel, measured with Pater's glass thermometer hung on a nail at the midpoint, read 42. Near the cave mouth, 47. The cabin was not comfortable. Marit could see her breath in the morning light, but Eli's water cup, set on the shelf by the bed where it had frozen solid every night for the past 3 weeks, showed no ice. The milk crock near the back wall stayed liquid. Marit had burned less than a third of the wood she normally burned on a night that cold. The numbers held a promise, but numbers on one night were not proof. Bray visited 2 days later. She stood inside the cabin with her coat still buttoned and her scarf still wound around her throat and looked at the milk crock. She pressed her hand against the back wall, near the door that led to the passage. She opened the door and felt the air moving through, steady, cool, earth-smelling. The milk did not freeze, Bray said. No. The water did not freeze. No. Bray rebuttoned her coat. Ordinary cold is no test, Marit. December cold is a warning. January cold is the judge. She paused at the door. But I would like to know what happens next. Reuben came the following week. He did not enter the cabin. He walked the length of the sod-covered ridge, pressed his boot against the earth covering, and frowned at the cave-in door. If this holds through a real blow, I will say so. If it does not, I will say that too. He mounted his horse. December is a child pretending to be winter. Quincy Dar found a different angle. At the store, he told neighbors that Marit was stealing warmth from hell itself. The line was absurd, but it carried a purpose. People who might have been curious about the tunnel now felt a vague unease, as though the cave connection was unnatural, dangerous, something that invited bad luck. Quincy did not need them to believe in hell. He needed them to hesitate before asking Marit for help. Tolef noticed the flaw in his last visit before Christmas. Frost feathering had formed around the edges of the cabin side door, delicate white crystals growing along the wood grain where warm indoor air met cold passage air and surrendered its moisture. The crystals were beautiful. They were also a warning. Warm air was escaping from the cabin into the tunnel faster than the stove could replace it. The door seal was imperfect. The air was leaking through the plank joints, through the frame gaps, through every crack the wood's imperfection provided. You are heating the tunnel instead of the cabin, Tolef said. He ran his finger along the frost line. This is your warm air leaving. Every crystal is heat you paid for with wood. He made her add a sill sweep, a strip of folded cowhide nailed to the base of the door so it dragged against the threshold when the door closed. He made her pack tallow-soaked rags into the plank joints. He checked the wool curtain and adjusted the gap at the bottom to 4 inches instead of 6. The system needed to breathe, but it could not gasp. The fix helped. The frost feathering diminished, but it did not disappear entirely. The cabin end door was not a machined seal. It was hand-hewn planks fitted by a woman and an old miner working with hand tools in freezing weather. It would leak. The question was whether it would leak slowly enough to work or fast enough to fail. The system worked imperfectly. That was honest. That was what mattered. A telegraph notice reached Forestville in the first week of January. A cold wave was indicated for the northern plains. The operators passed it along the line without alarm because cold waves came every winter and the telegraph always said the same thing. But Tolliff read weather the way he read candle flames. Not the report, but the signs around it. The day before the storm was warm, deceptively warm. Children walked to school with coats unbuttoned. Snow slid from roofs in heavy, wet sheets. Marit saw a flock of crows lift from the elm stand behind the bluff and turn south in a formation tight as a fist. She saw the cave mouth breathing mist, not the thin vapor of a cool space opening to warm air. A thick, slow exhalation, as though the earth were sighing. The pressure was changing. The cave felt it before the sky showed it. Marit brought extra wood inside. She filled the water pail. She checked the candle in the tunnel at knee height and watched it burn steady. She closed both doors and waited. January 11th, 1888. The thermometer read 34 degrees above zero at noon. Eli played outside without mittens. By midnight, the sky had changed. The morning of January 12th felt wrong because it felt kind. Snow softened underfoot. The eaves dripped. The cow stood in the lean-to with her face turned toward the sun, which was weak and pale, but present. Marit fed the stove, fed Eli, fed the cow. She opened the tunnel doors to let the passage air circulate and felt the familiar cool breath from the cave, steady, unchanging, indifferent to whatever the sky was doing. By noon, the warmth held. Neighbors later said it felt like March had come early. Children stayed outside. A man on the Forestville Road drove his wagon without gloves. By 2 o'clock, the light changed. The sky went from pale to white to a color that had no name. A gray that was not gray, a white that was not white, something that looked like the inside of a closed eye. The wind stopped. For perhaps 10 minutes, the air went perfectly still, as though the valley were holding its breath. Then the wind returned from the northwest, and it brought the end of the world with it. The temperature did not drop. It plunged. Marit felt it through the cabin wall. A physical blow, a pressure change that made the stove draft surge and the cabin creak like a ship in heavy seas. The wind did not build gradually. It arrived at full force, driving horizontal snow so dense that the lean-to 20 feet from the cabin door vanished. The sound was not a howl. It was a roar, low and constant, the sound of air moving fast enough to tear chinking from walls and drive snow through cracks that a knife blade could not find. Reuben's porch thermometer, nailed to his cabin post a 1.5 miles down the valley, dropped from the morning's thaw to 36 below zero before dark. It kept falling. By midnight, the mercury sat at the bottom of the tube, below the lowest mark, and frost had covered the glass so thick he could not read it anyway. Marit closed the cabin end door. She closed the cave end door to a 3-inch gap, the measured block. She hung the curtain. She fed the stove a full load of dry oak, the best wood she had, because this was the night the stove could not fail. Then she sat with Eli on the bed and listened to the house fight the wind. The fight was not equal. Within an hour, frost formed on every nail head in the cabin. The north wall, despite Marit's chinking, wept cold air through a dozen seams. The window, a single pane of glass Pater had hauled from town on his back, frosted solid from the inside. The floor near the door gap radiated cold so intense that Marit could feel it through her boots. But the back wall, the wall nearest the tunnel door, held differently. The air near the passage entrance was cold. It was not comfortable, but it was not the same cold that was killing the north wall. The tunnel air arrived in the high 30s, pushed by the stove's draw through 52 feet of earth-covered passage, and it created a zone of survivable air in the back half of the cabin. The stove heated it. The chimney pulled it. More tunnel air replaced it. The cycle was slow and steady, and it did not require the stove to fight the 40 below wind directly. It required the stove to raise 38-degree air to 60 degrees. That was a fight the stove could win. Then Eli began to cough. It started at dusk. A dry cough, the kind that sounds like bark peeling from a dead tree. Marit pressed her hand to Eli's forehead and felt the heat before she registered the fear. Fever. The child's skin was dry and hot, her eyes glassy, her breathing shallow between the coughs. She had been outside that afternoon, in the deceptive warmth without her heavy coat. Marit wrapped her in every blanket in the cabin. She boiled water on the stove for steam. She held Eli against her chest and felt the small body shudder with each cough. The child burned against her like a coal, and outside the temperature was still dropping, and the wind was still tearing at the walls. The cow broke loose at 9 o'clock. Marit heard it. A crash from the lean-to, a bawling sound that cut through the wind, then silence. The tie rope had snapped or the cow had pulled the stake. The lean-to leaked from 3 sides, and in this wind, it offered no more shelter than a fence post. If the cow wandered 10 feet into the storm, it would freeze standing up. If it came to the cabin door, Marit would have to open the door to bring it inside, and opening the door meant losing every degree the stove had fought to hold. She laid Eli on the bed. She opened the back door, the tunnel door, and crawled through the passage to the cave end, then worked her way along the back wall of the cabin to the lean-to. The wind hit her like a wall of needles. She could not see the lean-to until she was touching it. The cow stood jammed against the far corner, shaking, her eyes white. The tie rope lay in the mud. Marit grabbed the halter, pulled the cow out of the lean-to, and drove her around the back of the cabin to the shed extension near the tunnel entrance. The cow went because the shed was downwind, and the cow's instinct for shelter was stronger than her instinct for panic. Marit's right forearm hit the frozen hinge strap on the tunnel door as she forced it closed against the drifting snow. The strap, one of Niels Moen's wagon straps, bent and bolted into a hinge, had frozen into a ridge of ice-coated iron, and the edge opened a cut from wrist to elbow. She did not feel it at first. The cold had numbed everything. She felt it when she got back inside and the cabin's heat touched the wound. Then she felt it very much. She wrapped the cut with a strip of cotton, tied it tight, and checked Eli. The child was sleeping, but the fever had not broken. The cough came in waves, 4 or 5 racking sounds, then silence, then the sound again. If you are invested in this story, stay with it, because this is the moment when preparation stops being private and becomes the only chance someone else has. Torgrim Kvame arrived at the cabin door near midnight. He was Beret's eldest boy, 14 years old, tall for his age, but thin the way boys are thin when they grow faster than the food allows. He was half blind with frost on his eyelashes. His coat was buttoned wrong. He had no mittens. He had walked a quarter mile in the blizzard from Beret's cabin, following the fence line by touch because he could not see his own feet in the snow. "Mama's stovepipe split," he said. His voice was flat with cold. "The cabin is full of smoke. She cannot breathe. The little ones cannot breathe. She sent me." Marit looked at the boy. She looked at Eli on the bed. She looked at the cut on her forearm, still seeping through the cotton wrap. She looked at the tunnel door. If she left Eli alone in the cabin to guide Beret's family back, the child might worsen with no one to tend her. If she stayed, Beret and her 2 younger children would suffocate in a smoke-filled cabin or freeze trying to reach help. She made the decision in the time it took to pull on her coat. "Tollef," she said. The old miner was in the cabin. He had come the day before reading the sky the way he read candle flames, and had not left when the storm hit. His lungs were bad. His left knee swelled in cold weather until he walked with a limp that made each step a negotiation. But he could tend a stove, and he could watch a child, and he could read a flame. "Stay with Eli. Keep the stove fed. If she worsens, boil water and keep steam in the room. Do not open the front door for any reason. If you need air, use the tunnel door and control the gap. Tolliff nodded. He did not argue. He did not say she was reckless or brave. He sat beside the bed and laid his hand on Eli's forehead and said, "Go." Marit tied rope to the tunnel ridge, the sod-covered spine that ran from cabin to cave, and ran it to the woodshed, then from the woodshed to the fence post at the property line. She gave Torgrim the end of the rope and told him to hold it and not let go. She took the lantern. The lantern was useless in the wind. The flame died the moment she stepped outside. But the metal body of it was something to grip, something solid in a world that had dissolved into white noise and white air and white ground. They followed the rope. The wind pushed Marit sideways. Snow found every gap in her clothing, collar, cuff, the slash in her forearm wrap. Torgrim walked behind her, bent nearly double, one hand on the rope and one hand on Marit's coat. They could not see. They could not hear each other over the wind. They navigated by tension. The rope pulling left meant they had drifted right. The rope going slack meant they had gone too far. Niels Moen found them at the fence line. He had been driving home from the Kiln Road when the storm hit and had made it to his own cabin a half-mile south. He saw no light from any window. He knew the road. He knew the valley. He tied a rope to his doorpost and worked his way north because the Kvame cabin was between his place and Marit's, and he had heard that Beret's stovepipe was bad. They reached Beret's cabin together. The smoke inside was thick enough to taste. Beret crouched near the floor with her two younger children pressed against her, breathing through a wet cloth. The stovepipe had split along a rusted seam, and every draw of the stove pushed smoke into the room instead of up the chimney. The fire was nearly out. The temperature inside was dropping toward the temperature outside. "We go to my cabin," Marit said. "Rope line the whole way. Hold the rope. Do not let go." Beret did not argue. She wrapped her youngest in a quilt, tied the middle child to her waist with a strip of cloth, and followed Marit into the storm. The walk back took 40 minutes. It should have taken 5. The wind had drifted snow across the fence line, burying the lower rail and turning the rope line into a lifeline strung between invisible posts. Marit broke trail. Niels carried the youngest child. Beret held the middle child and the rope. Torgrim walked last, one hand on his mother's coat. They reached the tunnel entrance. Marit opened the cave-in door and pushed everyone inside. The passage was dark and cold and smelled like earth, and every person who entered it gasped, not from cold, but from the sudden absence of wind. The silence inside the tunnel was so complete that the children stopped crying. The air was in the low 40s, cool and still and utterly calm. After the howling chaos outside, it felt like stepping into a held breath. They walked the passage single file, 52 feet. The lantern, relit inside the cave where the wind could not reach, threw jumping shadows on the timber frames and slab roof and clay-packed walls. Beret's youngest child, 3 years old, stopped crying and stared at the shadows with the wide, silent attention of a child experiencing something that does not fit any category she owns. Tolliff opened the cabin end door. Heat spilled into the passage. Not much heat, not comfort, but heat that was winning its war against the cold because the stove was fed and the tunnel was breathing, and the system Marit had built was doing exactly what she had designed it to do. Beret's family filled the cabin, 5 adults and 4 children in a room 16 by 18 feet. Tolliff tended the stove. Niels stacked wood by the door. Marit checked Eli. The fever held. The cough continued, but the child was breathing and the air in the cabin was breathable. Beret sat on the floor with her back against the wall nearest the tunnel door and held her children and said nothing for a very long time. The contrast with the world outside was not metaphor. It was measurement. Outside, wind beyond measurement, snow horizontal, temperature dropping past 40 below, visibility measured in inches. The tunnel, above freezing near the cabin door, 42 degrees at the midpoint, 47 near the cave. The cabin, not comfortable. The floor was cold. The north wall still wept drafts, the nail heads still frosted, but the stove held the room near 50 degrees because it was not fighting 40 below replacement air. It was heating tunnel air that arrived in the high 30s. The difference was the difference between a battle the stove could win and one it could not. Eli's water cup sat on the shelf by the bed. By dawn, it remained liquid. Reuben Kettle's cabin, a mile and a half down the valley, burned through wood at a rate that terrified him. The wind found a chink seam he had missed in autumn and drove cold air through it like water through a breached dam. He fed the stove all night. He burned a full cord in a single night. By morning, his woodpile had a gap in it that looked like a missing tooth, and his beard was white with the frost that had formed on the air inside his own cabin. A hired man from an outlying claim tried to cross the 50 feet between his bunkhouse and the barn at midnight. They found him in the morning, curled against a fence post 10 feet from the barn door, frozen in the posture of a man who had given up trying to find something he could no longer see. Quincy Dar's store stayed warm. He had fuel stacked under credit from 3 families, and his building was the tightest structure in the valley, double-walled with sawdust insulation. But when a neighbor brought a child to the store door, a child stiff with cold, barely conscious, carried from a cabin that had burned through its wood by midnight, Quincy did not open the door until the child was blue. He opened it then because even Quincy Dar could not leave a dying child on his porch with men watching, but he opened it late, and people noticed. Dawn came slowly, the way light enters a room where someone has been very sick, not all at once, but in thin stages, each one revealing more of what the night had done. The wind eased, the snow thinned, the temperature held at the bottom of every thermometer in the valley, but the killing force of the wind began to fade. Marit stood at the cabin window and looked out through frost so thick she had to scrape it with a spoon handle. The world was white and still and rearranged. Snow had drifted against the north wall to the height of the eaves. The lean-to was buried. The tunnel ridge, that long, sod-covered spine between cabin and cave, wore a cape of snow that smoothed its shape into something almost natural, like a fold in the earth. Behind her, Eli coughed in her sleep. Beret's youngest child slept under Marit's quilt, thumb in mouth. The cow stood in the back shed, alive. Tullif sat in the chair by the stove with his eyes closed and his chest rattling with each breath, the cold having found his bad lungs and settled in. The stove was still burning, the tunnel was still breathing, the system had held. And Marit's firewood pile, the pile she had been watching all winter, counting and recounting, measuring the gap between what she had and what she needed, showed the most powerful number of the entire night. She had burned less than a third of what Reuben had burned. On the worst night in living memory, the night that killed a man 50 feet from a barn door, the night that froze water in cabins with full wood piles and tight walls, Marit Stensland's stove had burned 2/3 less fuel than every cabin in the valley. The tunnel had held. The cave had breathed. The earth had refused to surrender its warmth, just as her father had taught her in a root cellar in Valdres when she was 9 years old. But survival was not the end. It was the hinge. Because every person in the valley who had laughed at the widow hole, every man who had repeated Quincy Dar's line about a coffin built sideways, every woman who had pulled her children away, they were all about to see the numbers. And numbers, unlike mockery, do not care about opinions. The blizzard was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The storm left the valley under 3 feet of new snow and a silence so total that the first sound Marit heard the next morning was her own breathing. The dead man by the fence post was found before noon. Beret's cabin was full of frozen smoke. Reuben's woodpile had a crater in it, and every family within walking distance of the bluff knew one thing before sundown. Marit Stensland's cabin had held through the worst night in memory, and she had burned less wood doing it than any household in the valley. Reuben Kettle came on the 3rd day. He did not ride. He walked, because the snow was too deep for the gelding to manage the track. He came alone. He stood outside the cabin for a long moment, looking at the sod-covered ridge that ran from the back wall to the cave mouth, and then he walked the length of it the way he had walked it before, pressing, testing, measuring with his eyes. But this time the measurement was different. This time the ridge was buried under snow that had not melted, had not shifted, had not collapsed. The frames beneath it had held under the weight of earth and snow and wind, and the entire force of the worst storm he had seen in 30 years. He came to the cave-end door. He opened it. He stood in the entrance and felt the air, steady, cool, moving faintly toward the cabin where the stove's draw pulled it through. Then he walked the passage. 52 feet, stooped because the clearance was 5 feet, and Reuben stood 5 feet 10. He ran his hand along the timber frames. He pressed the roof slabs. He felt the drainage ditch with his boot toe. He paused at the midpoint and held still, and Merritt, who was watching from the cabin end, saw him do something she had never seen Reuben Kettle do. He closed his eyes. He stood in the dark passage with his hand against the timber and his eyes closed, and he listened to the silence. He emerged into the cabin. Eli was on the bed, fever-broken but still weak. Beret's children played on the floor with wooden spoons. The stove burned low. The room was cold by any standard of comfort, but warm by the standard of survival, which was the only standard that mattered after a night like the 12th. Reuben knelt at the tunnel sill. He pressed his hand flat against the timber frame of the door. He held it there. Then he looked up at Marit. "I called it a grave," he said. "I was wrong. It was a second wall." He did not become sentimental. He did not apologize. He asked for measurements. "How wide at the base?" 3 feet. "Height?" 5 feet to the crossbeam. "Frames?" "Every 4 feet. Flat limestone base, oak wedges." "Earth cover?" 18 to 24 inches. "The cave temperature. Did it hold?" 47 at the cave mouth, 42 at the midpoint, 38 in the cabin at dawn. Reuben stood. He looked at the passage entrance as though seeing it for the first time, which, in a way, he was. He had looked at it before and seen a trench. Now he looked at it and saw a principle. "You did not build a passage, Mrs. Stensland. You built an answer to the wrong question everyone has been asking. We have all been asking how to get more wood. You asked how to need less." He pulled on his gloves. "I would like to bring my sons to see this. They need to understand what I did not." He left. It was the most words Reuben Kettle had ever spoken to her at one time. It was also the last time he called her Mrs. Stensland. After that, he called her Marit. The neighbors came the following week, not in a group, one at a time, the way people approach something they are not sure they believe in. Halvor Tveit came first. He was a quiet man with a 40-acre parcel 2 miles south, and his cabin had nearly killed him on the 12th. He had burned his firewood, then his bench, then a shelf. He wanted to know how far a cave could be from the cabin. Marit told him distance mattered less than the earth cover. Even a short passage, 15 or 20 feet, with 18 inches of soil on top would buffer the air. But the cave had to be dry. A wet cave was worse than no cave at all. Halvor asked about drainage. Marit showed him the stone-lined ditches and the sump. She walked him through the passage with a candle at knee height and showed him how the flame held steady. He measured the post spacing with his arm span and asked whether pine would work instead of oak. Marit said pine would rot faster. Oak was better. Elm was acceptable. Pine was a last choice. Halvor left with a piece of flower board on which Marit had sketched the cross-section. Post dimensions, slab overlap, drainage pitch, door placement. He did not thank her. He studied the drawing the way a man studies a map of a place he intends to go. 2 days later, Astrid Lunde came with her husband. Their claim had no cave, but it had a south-facing hillside. Could the principle work without a cave? Marit thought about it. The cave was the air reservoir, the stable temperature source that fed the tunnel. Without a cave, the passage would dead-end in earth, and the air would not circulate the same way. But an earth-covered vestibule built into a hillside, with a sealed back wall and a front door, would still buffer the wind. It would still force replacement air to travel through earth before reaching the cabin. It would not be as effective as a cave connection, but it would be better than naked walls against the razor wind. Merritt drew a second sketch, a shorter passage, an earth-covered porch, really. double doors, buried barrel drain instead of stone ditches, because the Lundes did not have limestone nearby. She warned them that the barrel drain would need clearing every spring. The questions came with specific needs attached, and each one pushed Marit to think past her own design. One family had a root cellar already. Could it serve as the air source? Possibly, but only if the cellar was dry and the connection was properly framed. Another had a spring-fed creek running 20 feet behind the cabin. Would the water make an underground passage impossible? Not impossible, but dangerous without serious drainage. Marit refused to draw that family a sketch. The risk was too high. Bereikvama came last. She came on a Sunday, after church, still wearing her good coat. She did not bring her sons. She came alone, which meant this was a conversation she had thought about carefully. Beret did not do things without thinking. She stood in the passage with her hand on the wall and her eyes on the slab roof above her. She pressed the wood. She checked the drainage. She held the candle low and watched the flame. She did everything Marit had shown the other visitors, but she did it with the attention of someone who intended to build, not just to understand. When she came back into the cabin, she set 3 cured cowhides on the table. They were good hides, tanned and supple, the kind that took weeks of scraping and braining to produce. "For door sweeps," she said. "I need to learn how to build the vestibule you drew for the Lundes. My cabin has no cave, but I have a south slope and more determination than lumber." Marit looked at the hides. She looked at Beret. She remembered the word "if" hanging in the air between them months ago, when Beret had left the flower board on the table and driven away without judgment or encouragement. "We start with drainage," Marit said. Beret nodded. "You always start with drainage." "Because Tolef taught me that you build on the water you have moved, not on the water you hope will leave." It was not an apology. It was not a reconciliation scene with embraces and tears. It was 2 women who understood that survival in this valley was not a single act, but an ongoing negotiation with earth and cold and time, and that the negotiation went better with a partner. They started that afternoon. Beret's south slope was a 10-minute walk from Marit's bluff, and the soil was different, heavier clay, fewer stones, a tendency to hold water that Marit recognized immediately as the enemy. They spent the first hour not digging but testing. Marit drove a stick into the slope at 3 points and poured water at the top. They watched where it went. 2 of the 3 channels drained south within minutes. The third pooled and sat. Marit marked that spot with a cairn of stones. "We build around this," she said. "Never through it." Beret studied the pooling water. "How did you learn to test soil like this?" "Tolef. He said a miner who does not know where the water goes is a miner who does not come home." They marked the vestibule outline together, 12 feet long, 4 feet wide, a shorter and wider profile than Marit's tunnel because Beret's structure needed to buffer wind rather than connect to a cave. The back wall would be the hillside itself, packed and sealed with clay. The front would have double doors, just like Marit's design. The drainage would run downhill through a buried barrel with both ends knocked out, creating a simple pipe that channeled water away from the structure. Beret cut the first shovelful of sod and set it aside carefully. "For the roof," she said. She'd been watching Marit for months, even when she had not been helping. She had been learning from a distance the way careful people learn, by observation, by listening, by waiting until she understood enough to begin. Quincy Dar's first reaction to the validation was not conversion. It was fear dressed as contempt. At the store, he told anyone who would listen that Marit was endangering the valley. "She is encouraging women and fools to dig under themselves," he said. "The first one who builds a passage without knowing what they are doing will bury their family alive, and then we will see who is responsible." The argument had teeth because it was partially true. Underground construction was dangerous. A passage built without proper drainage could flood. A passage without adequate framing could collapse. A passage without door discipline could draw smoke or damp air into a living space. Marit knew this. Tolef had taught her every way a passage could kill before he taught her how to make one live. But Quincy was not motivated by safety. He was motivated by the same thing that had driven him to buy the hinge straps: control. If Marit's method spread, families would need less firewood. If families needed less firewood, they would buy less from the men who cut and hauled it, men who bought their supplies from Quincy's store. If the valley became more self-sufficient, Quincy became less necessary. And Quincy Darr's entire position in the community rested on necessity. He also wanted the Bluff parcel. He still wanted it. The proof-up deadline had not passed, and Quincy had not given up hope that Marit would fail to meet the improvement standard. If he could argue that the tunnel was not a legitimate improvement, that it was a dangerous novelty, not a permanent structure, he might find a sympathetic land agent willing to reject the claim. He had not yet made that move, but Marit could see it forming the way she could see weather forming, not in the sky but in the angle of Quincy's attention, the questions he asked at the store, the way he mentioned the homestead office in conversations that did not require it. The threat had changed shape, but it had not disappeared. Tollef and Marit deepened as collaborators in the weeks after the storm. The work shifted from survival to refinement. The passage had held through the blizzard, but it had also revealed its weaknesses. The cabin end door still leaked air through the plank joints. The earth cover on the middle section had settled unevenly, creating a low spot where snowmelt pooled. The cave end vent, the small sliding panel Marit had cut into the door, was too small to regulate airflow precisely in moderate weather. They fixed these problems together. Tollef showed Marit how to repack plank joints, using a mixture of tallow and wood ash that remained flexible in cold, brass, a technique from the mines, where doors had to seal against gas but still opened quickly. They dug out the settled section and added a layer of straw beneath fresh clay before recovering with sod. Marit cut a larger vent and fitted it with a sliding baffle made from a piece of oak shingle, so she could adjust the opening from a hand's width to fully closed. The collaboration produced something Tollef had not expected, a teaching pattern. As they worked, he described what they were doing in terms simple enough to repeat. Frames every 4 feet for normal soil, every 3 feet for wet soil, every 2.5 for sandy soil that shifts, double doors mandatory, stone drain mandatory. Candle test mandatory, every time, even if you tested yesterday. Wood swells in damp, shrinks in dry. Check your doors after every thaw. Marit wrote these rules on the back of the flower board in charcoal, not for herself, for the people who would come asking. On a quiet evening in late January, Tollef sat by the stove and told her about the mines. Not the techniques, the men. He told her about a Cornish timberman named Tregarin who could read rock the way other men read newspapers, pressing his ear to the face and listening for the sound that meant the stone was ready to move. He told her about a boy, 14, who had died in a collapse because the foreman set posts on wet floor and the shift boss did not check. He told her about the morning he walked out of the mine for the last time, his lungs already catching, and looked at the sky and thought it was the most frightening thing he had ever seen because it had no ceiling. Underground is not natural for people, he said. But it is honest. The rock tells you what it will do, the water tells you where it will go. If you listen, you live. If you do not listen, you die. There is no argument in it, no politics, just physics. Marit poured him chicory coffee. Is that why you stopped to help me? Because I listened to the water? I stopped because you were doing something I recognized. You were trying to make a space underground that would not kill you. I have spent my life doing that. I cannot walk past it. It was the most personal thing he had said to her. It was also a kind of confession. He helped because he could not help helping. The mines had made him into a man who saw underground structure the way other men saw plowed fields, as something that demanded attention and care and could reward both. They disagreed once. Tollef wanted to extend the passage into the cave by 10 feet, creating a larger air chamber near the tunnel entrance. Marit refused. The cave narrowed past the entrance, and the limestone was fractured in a way she did not trust. If they shored the extension and the ceiling cracked, the repair would cost more labor than the improvement was worth. Tollef argued. Marit held firm. She showed him the fracture lines with the lantern, tracing them with her finger across the low ceiling. You taught me to read the rock, she said. I am reading it. Tollef looked at the fracture lines for a long time. Then he said, You're right. And you did not need me to tell you. It was not a lesson. It was a graduation. Tollef's cough worsened in February. He had carried it since the mines, a deep, wet sound that lived in his chest like a permanent tenant. The blizzard night had aggravated it. Sitting in the cold cabin tending the stove while the wind howled had pushed something loose in his lungs that would not settle back. He coughed through conversations. He coughed while working. He stopped mid-sentence sometimes and bent at the waist, hands on knees, and coughed until his face darkened and his eyes watered. Marit told him to rest. He told her rest was for people who were finished working. He came to the cabin less often in late February, once a week instead of twice. His walk was slower. The bad knee had gotten worse, and now the other knee had started to swell. He carried his tools in a canvas sack instead of his hands because his hands shook when the cold touched them. On his last visit, the first week of March, he brought 3 things: his timber wedges, worn smooth from decades of use, his candle box, a tin container with a hinged lid that kept the testing candles dry, and a small notebook filled with cribbing marks, the shorthand mine timbermen used to record post spacing, rock conditions, and water levels. The marks were in pencil, faded, some in Norwegian, and some in a notation system Tollef had invented himself. "You will need these more than I will," he said. Marit understood what he was saying. She took the wedges, the candle box, and the notebook. She did not argue or pretend the gift meant something other than what it meant. Tollef Asen died on March 9th, 1888. He died in his own cabin, in his own bed, with his boots set neatly by the door and his coat hung on the peg where he always hung it. The cough had finally taken what the mines had loosened. He was 61 years old, and the last structure he helped build was a 52-foot passage from a widow's cabin to a cave on a limestone bluff above the south branch of the Root River. Marit heard the news from Niels, who had stopped at Tollef's cabin with a delivery and found the door unlatched. She did not cry in front of anyone. She went into the passage that evening with the lantern and walked to the cave end and stood in the dark where the air was 48 degrees and steady, and she held the candle box against her chest and breathed until the breathing was even. Later, emptying Tollef's canvas tool sack, she found sawdust caught in the turned-up cuff of his work coat. Fine oak dust, pale as flour, pressed into the seam by months of labor. She shook it into the stove. Not as waste, as the last dust of his work returning to heat, which was what all his work had been for. The secondary crisis arrived with the spring thaw. A family named Grindheim, 3 miles north on a parcel with heavy clay soil, had attempted to build a root cellar extension after seeing Marit's passage. The father, a stubborn man named Embret Grindheim, had copied what he thought he understood: dig a trench, frame it with posts, cover it with dirt. He had skipped the drainage. He had set his posts on bare soil instead of limestone bases. He had used green pine instead of cured oak, and he had built into a north-facing slope where snow melt channeled directly into the excavation. The meltwater came in the second week of March, running down the slope in rivulets that found the trench and filled it. The green pine posts, seated in mud, shifted. The crossbeams dropped. The earth cover, saturated with water, tripled its weight. The whole structure slumped on a Sunday morning while the Grindheim children played in the yard. The eldest child, a girl of 8, heard the sound first, a low groan, like wood bending past its limit, followed by a cracking noise, and then a soft, heavy thud as the earth fell inward. She ran to the house screaming. Embret came out and found his root cellar extension. 3 weeks of labor, a winter's worth of stored turnips and salt pork, buried under a mound of wet clay that steamed faintly in the morning air. No one was inside. That was the only mercy. But the collapse was visible from the road, a raw wound in the hillside where timbers poked from mud at wrong angles, and it was exactly the catastrophe Quincy Darr had warned about. Quincy moved fast. By Monday, he was at the store telling everyone that Marit's digging gospel had nearly killed a family. He used the word gospel deliberately. It made the method sound like a religion, which made Marit sound like a fanatic, which made anyone who followed her sound like a fool. He pointed out that Embret Grindheim had 3 children under 10. He asked whether the valley wanted to wait until a child was buried before admitting that the tunnel idea was dangerous. He asked it quietly, with the measured concern of a man who had warned everyone and been ignored, and the measured concern was more damaging than any shout could have been. The argument landed. People who had been curious about Marit's design stepped back. One family that had started trenching filled the trench back in. Halvor Tveit, who had taken Marit's sketch home and studied it for weeks, put it in a drawer and did not mention it when Quincy was in the store. The sewing circle sent no basket this time, but the silence was louder than the note had been. Marit heard about the collapse from Beret and rode to the Grindheim parcel the same afternoon. She walked the slumped trench the way Tollef would have walked it, slowly, reading the failure the way the old miner read rock. The diagnosis was immediate and specific. No drainage. The trench had no ditches, no sump, no stone lining. Water had entered freely and stayed. Wrong soil base. The posts sat on raw clay. Freeze-thaw cycles had heaved them out of plumb before the melt even started. Wrong wood. Green pine in wet ground would rot in a single season. Cured hardwood was the minimum. Wrong slope. A north-facing trench in heavy clay collected every drop of snowmelt the hillside produced. The site was wrong before the first shovel broke ground. Embret Grindheim stood beside the ruin and told Marit it was her fault. "You told people to dig," he said. "I dug." "I told people to drain before they dig," Marit said. "I told people to set posts on stone. I told people to test the site for water before breaking ground. You did none of those things." "You are proud, Mrs. Stensland. A woman who teaches men to build underground should expect that some will fail. A man who builds underground without asking a single question should expect that water will find him." It was the hardest confrontation she had faced since the blizzard, because Embret was not wrong about the danger and Marit was not wrong about the cause. Underground construction was dangerous. That was exactly why the rules mattered. Drainage mandatory, stone base mandatory, candle test mandatory. These were not suggestions, they were the difference between a structure that held and a grave. Marit organized a safer rebuild on higher ground. She chose the site herself, south-facing, well-drained, with limestone close to the surface. She poured water at the surface and watched it drain in both directions within a minute. She walked the slope above to confirm no channels would feed melt toward the trench. She marked the trench line and the drainage pitch with stakes and string. She specified oak posts on flat stone bases, 2.5-foot spacing because the clay here was soft. She drew the cross-section on a new piece of board and nailed it to a stake where Embret could see it every time he entered the trench. She visited every 3 days during the rebuild. She checked each post for plumb with a weighted string. She tested the drainage by pouring water at the cabin end and timing how long it took to reach the sump. She rejected 2 cross beams that had knots large enough to weaken them and made Embret cut new ones. He resented every correction. He did not argue because the collapsed ruin of his first attempt was still visible from the road, a permanent monument to what happened when a man built underground without listening to the water. Embret did not thank her. He built it correctly. The new structure held through the spring rains and was still standing when the first frost returned in October. He never mentioned Marit by name at the store, but when a neighbor asked him about the cellar extension, he said, "Ask the Stensland woman. She will tell you where the water goes." If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that the quiet work is often the work that saves people. The Grindheim crisis tested Marit in the way Tollef's departure had made inevitable. The old miner was gone. His lessons lived in Marit's hands and in his notebook of cribbing marks. But the authority to say no, to refuse a bad design, to insist on drainage, to walk away from a site that would not hold, that authority had transferred from Tollef to Marit, and Marit was a 29-year-old widow in a valley that still remembered laughing at her. She used the authority anyway. When a second family asked about building a passage into a wet cave with standing water on the floor, Marit refused to draw the sketch. The family called her difficult. Marit said she would rather be difficult than responsible for a drowning. Tolif's voice came through her mouth so clearly that she could almost hear the rasp of his damaged lungs behind the words. Niels Moen's partnership grew through shared labor. After the blizzard, he had begun stopping at the bluff parcel more often, not every day, not with the regularity of courtship, but with the steady frequency of a man who had found a place where his work was useful and his questions were answered. He hauled stone for Beret's vestibule project. He asked exact questions about post spacing and drainage pitch, and he accepted correction without bristling. When Marit told him a cross beam was 3 inches too low, he pulled it and reset it. When she showed him how to read the candle flame, he practiced until he could distinguish between good air and dead air by the flame's behavior alone. Their courtship was practical. He built a better stove collar for Marit's cabin, a sheet iron sleeve that sealed the gap between stovepipe and roof, reducing heat loss through the chimney hole. It took him 2 days, working in the cold on the cabin roof, fitting the iron with tin snips, and bending the flange by hand until the seal was tight enough that Marit could not slide a blade between collar and pipe. When he climbed down, his fingers were cut in 3 places from the sheet metal, and he held them under cold water at the pump without mentioning it until Marit saw the blood in the water and made him sit down. She bandaged his hands with the same cotton strips she had used on her own forearm after the blizzard. He held still while she worked. It was the first time they had touched for any reason other than passing a tool or steadying a beam. She taught him to read cave draw with smoke, holding a smoldering pine stick at the cave mouth and watching which way the smoke moved. When the smoke drifted inward, the cave was pulling. When it drifted outward, the cave was pushing. The direction told you about pressure, and pressure told you about weather. On a morning in late March, the smoke pushed outward with unusual force, and Marit told Niels to secure the lean-to. That afternoon, a wind came through the valley that tore a fence rail loose from a neighbor's post line. Niels said nothing about the prediction. He did not need to. The smoke had been right, and they both knew it. Niels never rescued Marit. He never arrived at the crucial moment with the crucial tool. He arrived regularly with steady hands and asked what needed doing, and the asking was the thing that mattered. Marit had survived the blizzard alone. She did not need saving. She needed someone who understood that the work was worth doing and would do it beside her without needing to be in charge of it. Niels understood this because he was a teamster, and a good teamster knew that the horses did the work, and the man's job was to know where to go and when to rest. By late March, Beret's vestibule was half built. Halvor Tveit had quietly resumed his trench work, this time with the correct drainage. And Quincy Dar was still talking at the store, but the audience was smaller now because the people who had survived the 12th of January remembered who had opened the tunnel door and who had been slow to open the store. Marit kept Tolif's candle box on a shelf by the back door. Every evening, before closing the tunnel for the night, she held a candle at knee height in the passage and watched the flame. Steady, always steady. The air moved, the earth held, the cave breathed. But Quincy had not made his final move, and the proof-up deadline was approaching, and the land agent had not yet seen the bluff parcel. The survival was won. The legacy was still at stake. The second winter came with a different weight. Marit entered it not as a widow counting cords, but as a woman who had survived the worst night the valley could remember, and done it with a method no one else had tried. The passage had been tested. The numbers were real. The cave still breathed at 48 degrees. The tunnel still held. The doors still sealed. But the real test of the second winter was not cold. It was what happened when a method that had been mocked became a method that was wanted. By October of 1888, Marit had drawn sketches for 4 families. 2 had caves on their property. One a shallow limestone opening similar to Marit's. The other a deeper passage that ran 30 feet back under a ridge. 2 had no caves, but had south-facing slopes where earth-covered vestibules could be built using the principles Marit and Beret had developed. Each sketch was specific to the site. Each included drainage, post spacing, door placement, and the candle test instruction that Tolif had drilled into Marit's hands. She taught a different way than Tolif had taught her. Tolif taught through demonstration. Do this, watch me, now you try. Marit taught through questions. When Halvor Tveit came to dig his cave-linked passage, Marit stood at the trench edge and asked him where the water would go. Halvor pointed downhill. Marit asked him to pour water and watch. The water pooled at a low spot Halvor had not noticed. He dug the drainage ditch before he set the first post. When Astrid Lunde's husband cut roof slabs with the bark stripped off, Marit asked him what would keep the dirt from sifting through the gaps. He looked at the bare wood and understood. He resplit the slabs with bark intact and laid them shingle fashion, bark up, the way Tolif had taught Marit in the third week of construction. The lesson landed harder because the man had made the mistake first. Marit refused to approve shortcuts. A family on the Forestville Road wanted to skip the second door because they had only enough lumber for one. Marit told them one door was no door at all. Without the airlock between two closed barriers, the passage became a highway for cold instead of a filter. The family argued that one door was better than the open wall they had now. Marit said one door with an open passage behind it was an invitation for the stove to pull uncontrolled air through 50 feet of tunnel and freeze the room faster than if the passage did not exist. They built both doors. A Norwegian couple, new to the valley, wanted to use their root cellar as the air source. The cellar was damp. Standing water gathered in one corner after rain. Marit went to look. She held the candle at knee height. The flame dimmed. She told them the cellar air was dead, that connecting it to the cabin would push stale, wet air into their living space, that damp air in a cold cabin would frost every surface and rot the bedding and the walls. They were angry. They said she was too cautious. 2 weeks later, they found mold climbing the cellar wall in a pattern that followed the air current exactly where Marit had predicted. They came back. She helped them ventilate the cellar first, then build the connection after the air tested clean. Teaching consumed time Marit did not have. The Bluff farm needed tending. The cow needed hay. Eli needed schooling. Marit taught her letters and numbers by candlelight using the cracked slate in Tolif's cribbing notebook, which contained enough arithmetic to keep a 6-year-old occupied for months. The flour sack behind the stovepipe held more money now. Neighbors paid for sketches and trade goods, not cash. And the shelf above the stove accumulated things Marit could not have bought. A bolt of wool cloth, 3 pounds of nails, a cured ham, a set of draw knife blades. But the days were the same length they had always been, and the work filled every hour of them. Niels came more often. He had given up pretending that the visits were about hauling lime barrels. He came because the Bluff parcel was where he wanted to be, and Marit was who he wanted to be near, and the work they did together, hauling stone, framing vestibules, reading the cave's breath, was better than the work he did alone. They married in the spring of 1889 in a ceremony at the church that Beret attended, and Quincy did not. The minister asked Niels if he understood that the homestead claim remained in Marit's name. Niels said he understood. The minister asked Marit if she intended to continue the underground work. Marit said she intended to continue everything. The proof-up had been settled by then. The land agent had come in late 1888, a dry man from the Rochester office who walked the property with a clipboard, in a manner that suggested he had seen 100 claims and believed none of them. Marit showed him the cabin, the improvements, the tunnel. She opened both doors and let him walk the passage. He stood at the cave end and wrote something on his clipboard. He asked how long the structure had been in place. Marit told him. He asked whether it had survived the January blizzard. She said it had. He asked whether she intended to remain on the claim. She said she intended to remain until she died. He approved the proof-up without comment. The claim was hers. The land was hers. Quincy Darr's quiet campaign to have the tunnel declared an illegitimate improvement died with the land agent's signature, and it died in silence, which was the way Quincy preferred his defeats, unremarked, unwitnessed, and stored for later use. Quincy's later use came the following winter. In January of 1890, a wagon loaded with flour from the Preston mill stalled in a ground blizzard 200 yards from Quincy's store. The teamster unhitched the horses and led them to shelter, but the wagon sat in the road with 40 sacks of flour exposed to driving snow. By the time the wind stopped, the flour was ruined, frozen, then wet, then frozen again. The sacks split and the contents turned to paste. That was the public loss. The private loss was worse. Quincy's back storeroom, the room where he kept his own reserve stock, the goods he did not sell but held against lean months, froze solid on the same night. The storeroom had a single door and no protected air draw. When the wind hit the building from the north, the door seams admitted cold air that pushed through the room like water through a broken dam. Two hired men who slept in the back room woke to frost on their blankets and their water pail frozen to the floor. Quincy's store was the tightest building in the valley. It had double walls and sawdust insulation, and a stove that could heat the front room in any weather. But the back room was an afterthought. Single-walled, single-doored, ventilated by gaps that Quincy had never bothered to seal because the back room was for storage, not for living. On a normal winter night, the back room stayed above freezing through shared heat from the front. On a blizzard night, the shared heat was not enough. The flour against the north wall froze into bricks. The molasses jug cracked. A barrel of salt pork developed a crust of ice on the brine that Quincy had to break with a hammer. He sent for Marit. Not by writing to her door. He sent a boy from town with a written note, which was Quincy's way of asking for help without being seen asking for help. The note said his storeroom was losing temperature and he wanted a consultation. It did not say please. It did not mention the tunnel. The word traveled through the valley faster than the boy traveled back. Quincy Dar, who had called the tunnel a coffin built sideways, who had bought hinge straps to stop Marit from building, who had used the Grindheim collapse to scare families away from her method, who had been slow to open his store door when a child was dying on his porch during the blizzard. Quincy Dar had sent for the widow on the bluff because his own storeroom was freezing and his own goods were spoiling and his own hired men were cold. Marit came. She brought Niels and a canvas sack of Tolef's tools, and she brought something else, a calm that had been earned through 2 years of being right when the people around her had been wrong. She did not gloat. She did not remind Quincy of the hinge straps or the coffin line or the way he had used the Grindheim collapse. She walked the storeroom the way she walked every space she was asked to evaluate. Slowly, reading the walls, the floor, the airflow, the temperature gradients. She pressed her hand against the north wall and felt the cold bleeding through. She checked the door seams with a candle flame and watched it gutter, air pouring in through gaps she could have sealed with tallow and cloth in an hour. The diagnosis was the same one she had given herself 2 years earlier, standing in her own failing cabin with smoke pushed sideways by the wind. "You have one door," she said. "You have no buffer. Every time the wind hits the north wall, cold air enters through the seams and pushes the warm air out. Your stove cannot heat faster than the wind can cool." "I know the problem," Quincy said. His voice was tight. The room was full of men, the same men who had laughed at her store 2 years ago, the same men who had repeated his line about the coffin. They were not laughing now. They were watching. "Then you know the solution," Marit said. "A second door, an airlock, earth cover if you can manage it, but at minimum a vestibule with sealed walls and a controlled gap. The stove must pull replacement air through the buffer, not through the cracks." "Build it." "No." The room went still. Quincy's face did not change, but his hands tightened on the edge of the counter. "I will teach you to build it," Marit said. "And you will build it correctly. You will set posts on flat stone. You will line the drainage. You will hang 2 doors and keep the gap controlled. And you will do it in front of these men so they can see that the method works the same way whether the builder is a widow on a bluff or a storekeeper in town." Quincy looked at the men. The men looked at Quincy. The silence held for a long time. "Tell me where the water goes," Quincy said. It came out like a sentence forced through clenched teeth, but it came out, and Marit heard in it not conversion but surrender, which was the closest thing to conversion that Quincy Dar would ever produce. She told him where the water went. She told him in front of the men. She made him repeat the drainage rule, the post spacing rule, the candle test rule, and the door discipline rule, while the men listened and Quincy's face darkened with each repetition. He built the vestibule in a week. He used oak posts on limestone. He lined the drainage ditch. He hung 2 doors. The storeroom held through the rest of the winter, and the hired men slept warm, and the reserve stock did not freeze. Quincy never thanked Marit. He never acknowledged the tunnel publicly. But he stopped mocking. The line about the coffin built sideways disappeared from his conversation as though it had never existed. And when, years later, a new family asked him about building into a hillside, Quincy said the only thing he could bring himself to say, "Ask Mrs. Moen where the water goes before you roof it." It was not warmth. It was not friendship. It was the grudging acknowledgement of a man whose pride had been broken, not by argument, but by circumstance. The most honest teacher the frontier had. By 1891, the Bluff farm had become what Marit had never planned, a demonstration. The expanded operation was visible from the road. The original passage still ran from cabin to cave, its sod-covered ridge now grass-grown and ordinary-looking, the kind of feature a stranger might walk over without noticing. But behind the cabin, connected to the tunnel system, Marit and Niels had built a cave-linked dairy room, a stone-floored chamber at the cave entrance, where milk crocks and cheese wheels sat in air that held near 48 degrees year-round. In summer, the dairy room was cooler than any spring house. In winter, it was warmer than any root cellar. The cave did not care about seasons. It held its temperature the way Marit's father had taught her. Slowly given, slowly lost. A storm passage branched from the main tunnel to a new woodshed Niels had built against the bluff face. In a blizzard, Marit could move from cabin to cave to woodshed without stepping outside. The rope lines she had strung during the children's blizzard were still there, anchored to posts, but they had become backup rather than primary. The passages were the primary. Every October, before the first frost, Marit held a teaching day. Neighbors came to the Bluff farm with questions, sketches, and sometimes their own horror stories of frozen cabins and split stovepipes. Marit walked them through the passage. She showed them the drainage. She demonstrated the candle test with Tolef's candle box, lighting the tallow candle and holding it at knee height while the visitors watched the flame. She let them feel the cave air, and then feel the outside air, and then feel the tunnel air, and she waited for the moment when understanding crossed their faces, the moment when they stopped thinking about temperature as a number and started thinking about it as a substance that moved and could be controlled. The teaching day became an institution. Families came from as far as Preston and Chatfield. Some had caves, some had hillsides, some had nothing but flat prairie and hard clay, and Marit told them honestly that the full cave passage system required a cave, and she could not make one appear where the geology said no. But even on flat ground, the principles applied. An earth-covered entryway with double doors reduced fuel consumption. A buried vestibule with a barrel drain kept the worst of the wind from reaching the cabin wall. The cave was the ideal. The idea was bigger than the cave. She kept a chalkboard nailed to the shed wall near the tunnel entrance. On it, she wrote the measurements that mattered. Slope pitch, post spacing, minimum door gap, maximum door gap, candle flame behavior at good air versus dead air, fuel burned per night with the tunnel versus fuel burned without. The numbers changed as she refined the method. The chalkboard was always current. Visitors copied the numbers onto scraps of paper, onto flower boards, onto the backs of envelopes. The numbers spread the way all useful numbers spread, hand to hand, house to house, each copy slightly different, but the principle intact. 6 neighboring families used versions of her design by 1891. Halvor Tveit had completed his cave-linked passage, shorter than Marit's at 35 feet, but properly drained and framed, with the bark-up roof slabs and double doors that had become standard. His fuel consumption dropped by more than half the first winter. He told Marit the numbers, and she added them to the chalkboard. Tveit passage, 35 feet, winter 90 to 91, 2 1/4 cords burned. Previous winter without passage, 5 3/4 cords. The numbers were the argument no skeptic could answer. Beret's earth-covered vestibule sheltered her cabin's back entrance, and her fuel consumption had dropped by nearly half. The Lundes had built into their south slope. Embret Greinheim's rebuilt cellar extension held through 2 winters without a crack. Marit checked it every autumn, pressing her hand against the timber the way Tolef had pressed his, reading the wood for rot, testing the drainage with water poured at the high end. 2 other families, newer arrivals who had heard about the blizzard and the tunnel and Marit's teaching days, had built hybrid designs. One a root cellar buffer connected to a vestibule, The other, an earth-covered storm porch with a barrel drain. Not every cabin could copy her. Marit was honest about this. Some land was too wet, some caves were unsafe. She had refused to approve 3 cave sites because the limestone was fractured or the air tested dead. Some families could not afford the labor or the hardware. The story of the tunnel was not everyone survived forever. The story was that a disciplined method for thinking about air, earth, and cold could make the difference between burning 6 cords and burning 2, between a cabin that fought the wind and a cabin that used the earth as a shield. Marit never used the word miracle. She used the word drainage. The years compress the way years do when the crisis is past and the work becomes routine. But routine on the Bluff farm was not stillness. It was the steady rhythm of a life built on principles that did not change, even as the world around them did. Marit and Niels had their first child together in 1890. A boy they named Peter, after the husband whose death had started everything. The naming was deliberate. Marit did not explain it. Niels did not ask. The child would carry the name of a man who had died cutting wood for a winter he did not survive, and the child would grow up in a house that survived winter through a method his dead namesake had never imagined. The irony was not lost on Marit. She held it the way she held most things, quietly, with both hands, without letting it show on her face. A second child, a girl named Ragna, arrived in 1892. Eli grew tall and serious and learned to test air in a passage before she learned to ride a horse. She carried Tollef's candle box the way other children carried dolls. Not as a toy, but as an instrument, a thing that had meaning because a man she barely remembered had given it to her mother, and her mother had kept it on the shelf by the back door where it could be reached without looking. Niels expanded the farm with the same patience he brought to everything. He built a larger stone spring house on the bluff above the cave entrance, using the cave's temperature to cool the spring water as it flowed through a stone channel he had laid himself. The work took 2 summers. He quarried the stone from the bluff face, cutting blocks along the bedding planes the way Tollef had taught Marit, and Marit had taught Niels. Each block was squared with a chisel and set with lime mortar Niels, mixed from the same kilns he had once hauled barrels for. The spring house became the farm's most profitable structure. Neighbors paid to store milk and butter in its cool chambers during the summer months when every other storage method failed. The cave that Reuben Kettle had called a cold cellar fit for potatoes had become a commercial asset that earned more in summer than the tunnel saved in winter. There was an evening in 1895 that Marit remembered for the rest of her life. It was September, warm, the kind of evening when the insects sang so loud the air seemed to vibrate. She sat on the bench outside the cabin with Niels beside her. Young Peter, 5, was chasing Ragna around the yard. Eli, 14, sat reading by the doorway with the last of the daylight. The cow, not the original cow, which had died in 91, but her daughter, bought from Beret in trade for a vestibule sketch, stood in the new barn Niels had built against the bluff. From the bench, Marit could see the tunnel ridge, grass-covered and ordinary, with wildflowers growing along its spine. She could see the cave mouth, dark and steady. She could see the chalkboard on the shed wall, still showing the measurements she updated every autumn. She could see the spring house roof above, solid stone. She could see, if she turned, the valley spreading south toward Forestville, where lights were beginning to appear in windows behind walls that were better sealed, better insulated, better connected to the earth than they had been 3 years ago. Not all of them, not most, but enough. Enough to know that the lesson had moved from her hands into other hands and would continue moving after she was done. Niels said, "Are you counting something?" "Yes." "What?" "Years." She did not say more. She did not need to. 8 years since Peter's death. 8 years since a woman with 1 cord of wet oak and $23 had stood in sleet beside a cabin that could not hold heat and looked at a cave that everyone said was useless. 8 years since Reuben Kettle had told her she would burn furniture by Christmas. 8 years since Quincy Darr had offered to take the burden. The burden had become a life. The cave had become a home. The coffin had become a doorway. Reuben died in 1893. He was 69. He died in the winter, which was fitting because winter had been his subject and his adversary for 40 years. In his last months, he told anyone who would listen that his winter rules had changed. He did not say Marit had changed them. He said the rules had changed, which was Reuben's way of admitting error without admitting error, and everyone in the valley understood what he meant. His sons, who had walked the passage at their father's insistence, built earth-covered vestibules on both their claims the following autumn. Beret became Marit's closest friend. The relationship that had started with the word if and 3 cured cowhides deepened into the kind of partnership that frontier women built when they recognized in each other the same refusal to accept the terms they had been given. Beret's vestibule held for years. She improved it twice, adding a second barrel drain and replacing the pine door frame with oak. She came to every teaching day, not as a student, but as a second teacher, and she answered the questions Marit did not have patience for. The questions about cost, about whether a woman could do the digging, about whether the method was worth the labor when a man had strong arms and a good crosscut saw. A strong man with a good saw still burns 6 cords, Beret told a skeptical newcomer in 1894. A woman with a passage burns 2. The saw does not change the math. The earth changes the math. It was the clearest articulation of the principle anyone had given, and it came not from Marit but from the woman who had once left the word if on the table and driven away. The Bluff farm grew. Marit kept Tollef's cribbing notebook in a drawer beside the flower board, the same flower board on which she had scratched the first cross-section of the tunnel in the autumn of 1887. The charcoal had faded. She traced over it in pencil. The measurements had not changed. 3 feet wide, 5 feet high, frames every 4 feet, drainage mandatory, doors mandatory, candle test mandatory. She added 1 line at the bottom in her own hand. Ask where the water goes before you put anything in its path. It was Tollef's lesson. It was her father's lesson. It was the lesson the earth teaches anyone who listens, and it was written in pencil on a flower board in a cabin on a limestone bluff in Fillmore County, Minnesota, where a woman who had been given every reason to leave had refused to go. The final scene belongs to a winter afternoon many years later. Marit's hair had gone gray at the temples, then fully gray, then white at the front where the wind hit it when she stood at the cave mouth checking the draw. Her hands were still strong, the calluses had never fully smoothed, the ridges of hard skin still mapping the grip of mattock and chisel and froe. But they moved more slowly now, and the right wrist that had swollen during the limestone shelf encounter still ached when the barometer dropped. She was past 50. The Bluff farm had been hers for more than 20 years. The tunnel had held for every one of them. Eli was grown and married to a carpenter's son in Preston. She had taken with her a knowledge of underground air that her husband found strange and useful. Strange because his wife could predict weather changes by holding a smoldering stick at a cave mouth. Useful because the root cellar she designed for their house never froze and never flooded, and kept their butter cold through every July. Peter, the boy named for his dead father, worked the farm with Niels and had hands that looked like his mother's, thick, calloused, careful, the kind of hands that tested a surface before trusting it. Ragna, the youngest, had her mother's habit of testing things before trusting them, and her father's habit of asking exact questions. She was the one who checked the chalkboard every autumn, updating the numbers in neat hand-printed figures that were cleaner than Marit's, but carried the same information. On this afternoon, a day in late November with new snow on the ground and the air tasting of iron, Marit opened the tunnel door and walked the passage with Ragna's daughter. Her granddaughter, 4 years old, a child who had never known a winter without the tunnel and therefore did not understand what the tunnel meant. The passage was the same as it had always been, 5 feet high, 3 feet wide, oak frames every 4 feet, slab roof with bark up, drainage ditches running clean to the stone sump near the cave. The timber had darkened with age, the oak turning from pale gold to a deep umber that absorbed the lantern light. Some frames had been replaced. Marit swapped them on a rotation, pulling any post that showed soft spots and setting a fresh one in its place. The earth smell was richer than it had been in the first year, the scent of soil and stone and old wood blending into something that was not unpleasant, something that smelled like the inside of the earth itself. But the air moved the same way it had moved on the first night Marit tested it, steady, cool, pulled by the cabin stove through 52 feet of earth and stone. The candle in the child's hand, held at the proper height because even a 4-year-old on this farm learned where to hold a candle, burned without a flicker. They emerged at the cave mouth. The limestone bluff rose above them, pale and ancient, unchanged by anything that had happened at its base. Snow lay on the ground. The air outside was sharp and clean and cold. Inside the cave, the air was what it always was. 48 degrees, give or take, year-round, regardless of the season, regardless of the century. The child put her hand against the cave wall. She pulled it back. "It is cold," she said. Marit smiled. It was the same smile her father had worn in the root cellar in Valdres, standing beside a wall of damp stone while the fjord wind screamed outside. "Only in summer," Marit said. The child did not understand. She would, eventually. The earth teaches slowly, and it does not repeat itself, and it does not care whether you are listening. But if you listen, if you press your hand against the stone and then against the wind and feel the difference, the lesson is the same one it has always been. The cold is not the enemy. The cold is a fact. The enemy is the air you cannot control. And the answer is not more fire. The answer is the earth itself, which gives its warmth slowly and takes it back slower still, and which has been doing this longer than any cabin, any stove, any human life. Marit Stensland Moen died in 1917 on the Bluff farm near the south branch of the Root River. She was 59 years old. She left behind a husband, 3 children, 6 grandchildren, a dairy room carved into a limestone cave, a storm passage that had not failed in 30 winters, and a candle box on a shelf by the back door that still held 3 tallow candles, dry and ready to test the air. In the years after the razor wind winter, at least 6 households in the Root River Valley adopted some version of the system Marit Stensland had built. One family copied the full cave passage. Others built earth-covered storm porches, root cellar buffers, or double-door windlocks. The spread was visible in a single image, autumn smoke rising from cabins whose back walls no longer faced winter naked, whose doors opened not into the wind, but into the earth. Marit lived out her life on the Bluff farm. She kept Tollef's candle box on the shelf by the back door and taught children to test air before trusting darkness. The last entry in Tollef's cribbing notebook, written in Marit's hand, read, "Candle steady at knee height in passage, October 14th, 1916. Air moves. Earth holds." They had called her project a coffin built sideways. The same ridge of sod where men had laughed now lay grass-covered and ordinary, with children running over it in summer without knowing how many calculations lay beneath their feet. How many nights of candle testing, how many posts set on limestone, how many drainage ditches lined with flat stone and sloped at 1.5 inches every 10 feet toward a sump that still ran clear. The cave door opened as it always opened, not to magic, not to miracle, but to a steady breath of earth-temperature air in a world of snow. What they called a grave had been a doorway all along,